The job posting seemed too good to be true. $75 an hour to map cave systems for a private geological survey company. No experience required, just a strong stomach and willingness to go underground. I was 3 months behind on rent and living off ramen noodles, so I didn't ask many questions when they called me back the same day. The company was called Subterranean Solutions, and their office was a single room above a pawn shop downtown. Mr. Hendricks, the owner, was a thin man with yellowed teeth and hands that shook when he poured coffee. He explained that they were contracted by the state to map unexplored cave systems for safety purposes. Tourism was booming, and they needed to know which caves were safe for guided tours. "You'll be working alone mostly," he said, sliding a contract across his desk. "Some of these caves haven't been entered in decades. That's why the pay is so good." I signed without reading it. The first paycheck would cover my rent and then some. He handed me a helmet with a mounted light, a digital measuring device, and a waterproof tablet for recording data. The equipment looked expensive and well-maintained. "Your first assignment is Whispering Hollow, about 2 hours north of here. Small cave system, shouldn't take more than a day to map the main passages." The drive north took me through increasingly remote countryside. Rolling hills gave way to dense forest, and the GPS led me down a dirt road that seemed to go on forever. I almost missed the turnoff to the cave entrance. There was no sign, just a narrow trail through the trees marked by orange spray paint on the trunks. I parked next to a rusted pickup truck that looked like it had been there for years. The cave entrance was a black hole in the limestone cliff face, maybe 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. No gate, no warning signs, nothing to suggest this was an official survey site. But Hendricks had been specific about the location, and I needed the money. The air coming from the cave was noticeably cooler than the humid summer heat outside. I strapped on my helmet, turned on the light, and stepped into the darkness. The entrance passage sloped downward at a gentle angle, wide enough that I could walk upright without touching the walls. My footsteps echoed strangely in the enclosed space. The sound seemed to bounce back from much farther away than it should have, as if the cave was much larger than it appeared. I began taking measurements and entering data into the tablet, creating a digital map as I went deeper. After about 100 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber. My helmet light couldn't reach the far walls, so I took out a stronger flashlight to get better measurements. The room was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, with several smaller passages leading off in different directions. That's when I noticed the truck outside wasn't the only sign that people had been here before. There were boot prints in the soft cave floor. Not fresh, but not ancient either. Someone had been walking around down here recently, and their prints went in circles around the chamber like they'd been looking for something. I followed the largest passage deeper into the cave system. The walls here were covered in flowstone formations that looked like frozen waterfalls. Beautiful, but they made the passage narrow and difficult to navigate. I had to duck under low-hanging formations and squeeze through tight spots where the walls closed in. The measuring device started acting up about 500 feet from the entrance. The digital display flickered and showed impossible readings, negative distances, measurements that changed while I watched. I tried resetting it, but the numbers kept jumping around randomly. Great. Expensive equipment failing on my first day. I decided to continue mapping by hand, estimating distances and drawing rough sketches on paper. The passage ahead split into 3 different routes. I chose the middle one, which seemed to slope downward more gradually than the others. The air was getting warmer as I went deeper, which struck me as odd. The passage walls began to change character. Instead of smooth limestone, they became rough and pitted, as if something had been scraping at them. Deep gouges ran along both sides at about shoulder height, too regular to be natural erosion. They looked almost like claw marks, but that was impossible. No animal large enough to make marks like that could survive in a cave system this deep. I stopped to examine the gouges more closely. They were definitely made by something sharp, and they were recent. Fresh limestone dust covered the cave floor beneath them. Whatever had made these marks had been here very recently, maybe even within the last few days. A sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the cave, a low scraping noise like something heavy being dragged across stone. I froze and listened, but it didn't repeat, probably just rock settling or water dripping in a distant passage. Caves made all kinds of strange noises. But then I heard it again, definitely not water or settling stone. It sounded like movement, deliberate and rhythmic. Something was down there in the darkness ahead of me, and it was coming closer. I turned off my helmet light and stood perfectly still. The sound stopped immediately, as if whatever was making it knew I was listening. Minutes passed in complete silence and absolute darkness. I couldn't even hear my own breathing over the blood rushing in my ears. When I finally turned the light back on, there were fresh boot prints in the cave floor right next to where I was standing. Someone had walked up to within arm's reach of me while I stood there in the dark, then walked away without making a sound. The prints led back the way I had come, toward the entrance. I should have left right then. Every instinct told me to get out of that cave and never come back. But I needed the money, and I'd only mapped maybe a quarter of the system. Hendricks had made it clear that I needed to complete the job to get paid, and there was probably a reasonable explanation for everything. The main passage continued deeper into the hillside. I followed it for another few hundred feet, taking notes and making sketches despite the malfunctioning equipment. The strange gouges in the walls became more frequent and more pronounced. Whatever was making them was getting more aggressive. The passage opened into another large chamber, this one much bigger than the first. My light couldn't reach the ceiling or the far walls. The floor was covered with a thick layer of what looked like fine sand, but when I knelt down to examine it, I realized it was pulverized bone. Thousands of small bones had been ground into powder and scattered across the chamber floor. I could make out fragments of what might have been rabbit skulls, bird bones, maybe some small rodents. The entire floor was carpeted with the remains of dead animals, crushed so fine it was almost like walking on flour. In the center of the chamber sat a single folding chair, the kind you'd bring camping. It was facing away from me, toward the far wall of the chamber. Someone had been sitting there recently. The bone dust around the chair legs was disturbed, and there was a clear impression in the seat where a person had been. I walked around to the front of the chair. Scratched into the cave wall in front of it were dozens of tally marks, grouped in sets of 5. I counted them quickly, 137 marks total. Someone had been sitting in this chair, facing this wall, keeping count of something for a very long time. Below the tally marks, carved deeper into the stone, was a single word: feeding. The scraping sound started again, much closer this time. I spun around, sweeping my light across the chamber, but saw nothing. The sound seemed to be coming from all directions at once, echoing off the walls and ceiling. Something large was moving through the chamber, staying just outside the range of my light. I backed toward the passage I'd entered through, but when I turned around, it wasn't there anymore. The chamber wall was solid stone with no opening. That was impossible. I'd just walked through that passage minutes earlier, but there was no sign of it now, just smooth limestone wall. I searched frantically around the perimeter of the chamber, looking for any way out. There were several small openings, but they were too narrow for a person to fit through. The folding chair sat in the middle of the chamber like a throne, surrounded by the bone dust of countless dead animals. That's when I realized the tally marks weren't counting feedings. They were counting days. Someone had been trapped in this chamber for 137 days, sitting in that chair, watching something feed on whatever small animals wandered into the cave, and judging by the fresh impression in the seat, they might still be here. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed strangely, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "Is someone there? I'm with the Geological Survey. I'm here to help." The scraping sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I could feel something watching me from the darkness beyond my light, patient and hungry. Then I heard breathing that wasn't my own. Slow, deliberate breaths coming from somewhere very close. I swept my light back and forth across the chamber, but the beam seemed weaker now, barely penetrating a few feet into the darkness. "I know you're there," a voice said from the shadows. It was hoarse and raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken in months. "You're the new one. They sent you to replace me." I turned toward the voice, but my light revealed nothing. "Replace you? I don't understand. I'm just here to map the cave system. Who are you?" "I was the last one," the voice continued. "Before me there was someone else. Before him, someone else. We all came for the mapping job. Good pay, they said. Easy work." A bitter laugh echoed through the chamber. "Easy work. Where are you? I can't see you." I kept turning in circles, trying to locate the source of the voice, but it seemed to move around the chamber. "I'm everywhere now," he said. "Part of the cave, part of the system. You'll understand soon enough. It doesn't let you leave, you see. Not until there's a replacement. That's the real job. Not mapping caves, but feeding it, keeping it satisfied so it doesn't come up to the surface." The bone dust beneath my feet began to shift and swirl, forming patterns like tiny whirlwinds. Something was moving beneath the floor, displacing the pulverized remains of decades' worth of small animals. The patterns grew larger and more aggressive, and I realized they were forming a circle around me. "What is it?" I asked. "What lives down here?" "I don't know," the voice replied. "I never saw it clearly. None of us did. It stays in the shadows, always just out of sight. But it's big and it's hungry, and it's been here for a very long time. The cave isn't natural. It's been carved by something living down here, growing larger as it gets bigger." The walls of the chamber began to change. What I thought were natural limestone formations started to move and shift. The entire space was breathing, expanding and contracting rhythmically like the inside of some massive lung. The gouges I'd seen earlier weren't claw marks. They were growth marks, places where something had scraped against the walls as it expanded. "The company knows," the voice continued. "Hendricks knows what this place really is. They've been sending people down here for years, one at a time. The pay is good because it's not really a job. It's a sacrifice. They feed it regularly to keep it underground." I tried to run toward one of the small openings in the chamber wall, but the bone dust rose up around me like a sandstorm. I couldn't see anything, couldn't breathe properly. The powder got in my eyes and nose, tasting like death and decay. When it finally settled, I was back in the center of the chamber, next to the folding chair. "Sit down," the voice said, closer now. "It'll be easier if you just sit down and wait. Fighting only makes it angry, and when it's angry, it takes longer. Much longer." "No," I said, backing away from the chair. "There has to be another way out." You said there were others before you. How did they get out? They didn't, he replied. None of us got out. We stayed until we became part of the cave, part of the feeding cycle. Then a new person came and we could finally rest. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. The chamber walls continued to pulse and breathe around me. I could see now that what I'd thought were rock formations were actually organic structures. Ribs, maybe, or some kind of internal framework. The entire chamber was inside something alive. Something massive that had been growing underground for decades or centuries. How long have you been here? I asked. I stopped counting after the first year, the voice said. Time doesn't mean much down here. Days and nights are the same. Seasons don't matter, just the feeding schedule. Small animals at first, then larger ones as it grows. It's almost ready for the next stage now. What's the next stage? People, he said simply. It's gotten big enough to need more substantial food. That's why they're sending more of us down here now. Not just to feed it, but to feed it properly. To help it grow to full size. I felt around the chamber walls more carefully, looking for any opening I might have missed. The stone was warm to the touch and slightly soft, like skin rather than rock. In several places I could feel a pulse running through the walls, a slow, steady heartbeat that shook the entire chamber. There, the voice said, and I felt something touch my shoulder. Do you feel it now? The heartbeat? You're inside it. We all are. This isn't a cave at all, it's a living thing. Something that's been growing underground for longer than anyone can remember. I spun around, but there was no one behind me. The touch had felt real, solid, but my light revealed nothing. Just the folding chair and the endless carpet of bone dust and the tally marks on the wall. The marks, I said, suddenly understanding. You weren't counting days. You were counting how many people it's eaten. Both, the voice replied. 137 days, 137 people. It eats one person per day once it reaches this size. That's why they keep sending us down here, to maintain the feeding schedule. The chamber began to contract around me. The walls moved inward slowly but steadily, reducing the available space. The ceiling lowered until I had to duck, then crouch, then finally sit in the folding chair just to avoid being crushed. Don't fight it, the voice said. It's easier if you don't fight. But I couldn't just sit there and wait to die. I pulled out my phone, hoping somehow to get a signal and call for help. But the screen was black. The device was completely dead, even though it had been fully charged when I entered the cave. The tablet and measuring equipment were dead too. Nothing electronic worked in here. The walls continued to close in. Soon I would be pressed flat against the folding chair, unable to move. The bone dust swirled around me in tight spirals, and I could hear something moving in the walls themselves. A wet, sliding sound, like a massive snake moving through mud. Wait, I said. The truck outside. If people keep disappearing down here, why is there still a truck in the parking area? The voice was quiet for a long moment. Then, what truck? There was a rusted pickup truck parked near the cave entrance. It looked like it had been there for years. I walked here, the voice said slowly. From town. They told me to take a bus to the main road, then hike in. There was no truck when I arrived. Then whose truck is it? Another long silence. The chamber walls stopped closing in, as if the thing around us was listening to our conversation. Someone else is here, the voice whispered. Someone who came in a truck and never left. But if they never left, And they're not in here with us. I understood immediately. There was someone else in the cave system, someone who had found a way to avoid being trapped in the feeding chamber. They were still here, still alive, moving through passages we couldn't see. "Hello!" I shouted, as loudly as I could. "If there's someone else down here, help us. We're trapped." My voice echoed through the chamber and beyond, carrying through passages and openings I couldn't see. For several minutes, there was no response. Then faintly, I heard an answer from somewhere far away. "Stay where you are. I'm coming." The chamber walls began to pulse more rapidly, and the bone dust rose up in angry clouds. Whatever lived here didn't like the idea of someone interfering with its feeding schedule. The organic walls started to secrete some kind of fluid, thick, yellowish liquid that dripped from the ceiling and pooled on the floor. "It's getting angry," the first voice said. "No one has ever interrupted the feeding before. It doesn't know how to react." The sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere outside the chamber. Whoever was coming was moving fast, running through passages I couldn't see or access. The creature around us began to thrash and writhe, and the chamber walls buckled and twisted. "Here!" a new voice called out, much closer now. "Can you hear me? I'm right outside." "We can't get out," I yelled back. "The entrance sealed up. We're trapped inside." "No, you're not trapped inside," the voice replied. "You're trapped on the outside. The real cave entrance is through the feeding chamber. What you think is the cave entrance is actually an exit. It only opens outward." I looked around the chamber with new understanding. The folding chair wasn't positioned randomly. It was facing the real entrance to the cave system, hidden somewhere in the wall behind the tally marks. The person keeping count had been watching that entrance, waiting for something to emerge. "Move away from the chair," the voice outside commanded. "Get as far back as you can." I pressed myself against the far wall of the chamber. The bone dust beneath my feet was several inches deep, the accumulated remains of years' worth of feeding. But now I realized it wasn't just animal bones. Mixed in with the small fragments were larger pieces, unmistakably human. An explosion echoed through the chamber, and a section of the wall behind the tally marks cracked and crumbled. Light poured through the opening. Not the harsh white light of a helmet lamp, but warm yellow light like sunlight. Someone had blasted a hole in the chamber wall from the other side. "Come on!" the voice shouted, "before it heals itself!" I scrambled toward the opening, but the chamber began contracting again, trying to prevent my escape. The walls pressed in from all sides, and acidic fluid dripped more heavily from the ceiling. The creature was trying to digest me before I could get away. I squeezed through the opening just as the walls slammed shut behind me. The space I emerged into was completely different from the claustrophobic chamber. A vast natural cavern with multiple levels and pools of clear water. Sunlight streamed down through openings in the ceiling far above. The person who had rescued me was a woman in her 50s, wearing caving gear and carrying a backpack full of explosives. She looked tired and dirty, like she'd been underground for a long time. "How long have you been down here?" I asked. 3 years, she replied. "I was supposed to map this system just like you, but I figured out what was really happening before it trapped me in the feeding chamber. I've been living in the real cave system ever since, trying to find a way to kill this thing." "The real cave system?" "What you experienced was just the creature's digestive tract," she explained. "The actual cave system is much larger and completely separate. The creature has been using the fake cave entrance to lure people into its stomach. It's been feeding and growing for decades." We walked through the natural cavern, and I could see evidence of her long occupation: sleeping areas, food supplies, equipment caches. She had been preparing for something, gathering resources and planning. I've been mapping the creature's anatomy, she continued, finding its weak points, places where explosives might do real damage. But I needed help, someone to distract it while I planted charges in the vital areas. Is that why you didn't rescue the others? The people who were trapped before me? Her expression darkened. I tried. But by the time I figured out how to access the feeding chamber from this side, they were already absorbed. The creature doesn't just eat its victims, it incorporates them somehow. They become part of its consciousness. I thought about the voice I'd heard in the chamber, the person who claimed to have been trapped for over a year. Are they still alive in there? In a way, she said. They're aware, but they can't act independently. The creature uses their memories and personalities to make itself seem more human, to lure new victims. Everything that person told you was probably true, but it was the creature speaking through him. We reached a pool of clear water near the center of the cavern. She knelt down and began pulling plastic-wrapped packages from her backpack. Military-grade explosives, enough to level a building. This is it, she said. The creature's main nervous system runs right underneath this pool. If we can place these charges correctly and detonate them simultaneously, we can kill it completely. What about the people trapped inside? If they're still conscious, they'll be free, she said firmly. Death is better than what they're experiencing now. Trust me, I've been listening to their voices for 3 years. They're begging for it to end. We worked together to waterproof the explosives and attach timer detonators. The creature above us had gone quiet, but I could feel it listening, trying to understand what we were doing. The organic walls of its digestive system were probably still contracting and expanding, searching for its lost prey. When we trigger these, she said, we'll have about 30 seconds to get to the surface. There's a rope ladder hidden near the main entrance. Follow me and don't stop for anything. She activated the timers, and we ran. The natural cavern had multiple levels connected by narrow passages and rope bridges she had constructed over the years. We climbed steadily upward, racing against time and the growing rumble from below as the creature began to realize what was happening. The explosions, when they came, shook the entire hillside. Trees toppled outside and rock slides blocked several of the natural cave entrances. But we made it to the surface just as the creature's death throes began, a sound like a mountain screaming, echoing from deep underground. The rusted pickup truck was still parked where I'd left it, but now I understood whose it was. She led me to it and pulled keys from her pocket. This was my truck, she explained. I've been keeping it running all these years, maintaining it with supplies I hiked in from town. Always figured I'd need it eventually for a quick escape. As we drove away, I could see the hillside collapsing behind us. The creature's death had destabilized the entire underground structure, and the land above was sinking and cracking. Whatever that thing had been, it was definitely dead now. What was it? I asked. How long had it been down there? I think it was some kind of prehistoric cave organism, she said. Something that evolved to mimic cave systems to attract prey. It had probably been down there for centuries, maybe longer, slowly growing and perfecting its hunting strategy. And the company? Hendricks and Subterranean Solutions? They knew exactly what they were doing. I found records in one of the deeper passages. They've been feeding this thing for at least 20 years. Missing persons reports, insurance payouts, the whole operation. It was a business arrangement. We drove straight to the police station in town. The story made national news within days. A mining company had been deliberately sending people to their deaths to feed some kind of underground creature. Hendricks and several others were arrested, though they all claimed they thought it was just a dangerous cave that sometimes had accidents. The hillside where the cave had been was declared a geological hazard zone and fenced off permanently. Official reports blamed the collapse on unstable limestone formations, though a few geologists noted that the underground structure had been unlike anything they'd ever seen. I never went back to cave mapping. The money wasn't worth the risk, and I'd learned that some jobs that seem too good to be true usually are. But sometimes, late at night, I still think I can hear voices calling from deep underground, the people who were absorbed by that creature, finally free but still echoing in the darkness. The woman who saved me retired from caving entirely. We stay in touch, and sometimes we talk about those 3 days underground. She says the hardest part wasn't the danger or the isolation. It was listening to the voices of the people trapped in the feeding chamber, knowing she couldn't save them but unwilling to abandon them. We both sleep better now, knowing that thing is dead and gone. But we've also learned that there are jobs you shouldn't take, no matter how much they pay. And if someone offers you easy money to go underground alone, you should probably ask a lot more questions than I did. The cave mapping industry cleaned up its act after the scandal, with new regulations and safety requirements. But I still wonder sometimes how many other companies out there are offering jobs that are too good to be true, and what kinds of things they might be feeding in the dark places underground. Some doors should stay closed, some caves should never be mapped, and some jobs are worth more than money. They cost pieces of your soul that you never get back.